Hello and welcome to the Pivot Leadership Podcast. I'm Emma Chandler and I'm excited to have you here today as we explore the science of leadership, dive into how the brain works and hopefully learn a few things that will transform the way you lead. I created the Pivot framework to help leaders change their work environments for the better by harnessing the power of neuroscience. Whether you're guiding your team through change or looking to elevate your own leadership game, this podcast is designed to help you unlock the next level of success. So, what does it mean to pivot? Well, it's all about mastering perseverance, inclusion, value, optimisation, and trust. These 5 principles are the building blocks of leadership that lasts. Throughout this podcast, I'll be joined by inspiring guests as we unpick each of these competencies and share actionable insights on how to apply them. So lean in, get ready to lead, pivot, and unlock your potential. In this episode, I'm joined by Andrew Payne. Andrew is an award-winning mental health speaker and podcaster and helps people build teams grounded in psychological safety. Drawing from his own experiences, Andrew challenges stereotypes and inspires unity. He breaks down barriers, showing organisations how to create a culture where everyone feels that they belong and are valued. Today, we're going to be chatting specifically about men's mental health and how to address it in the workplace, so the men in our workplace can feel optimised. Welcome to the podcast, Andrew. Thank you so much for being here.
Thanks. It's a pleasure to be here.
I know this is a busy time for you, so I want to kind of get straight into it. Can you tell us about the work that you do and how you came into this? Because I know it's really interesting.
Yeah, so people ask me what I do, and I'm about to say, well, I'm a trainer, or am I a public speaker? Am I a bit of, in fairness, I'm a bit of both. So generally, I am a speaker. There's a lot of guys that work sort of one-to-one with men as like a men's coach. For me, I work with businesses and organizations trying to raise awareness and help them in reaching out to their men and engaging their men. So increasingly, I talk to organizations where they'll say things like, well, look, we have a women's network that has budget, have done for years, and we've really realized that we have nothing for men at all. And then there is a concern, but if we have something for men, will it be a return to the old boys network? And just kind of, maybe we need to embrace this with a bit more of a holistic view. Is that the right word? A bit more of an open mind. And so I talk about men's mental health at big events, at conferences, wellbeing events, lunch and learning events, really examining why are men and boys struggling, look at the complex data and many, many complex reasons as to why that's the case. And therefore, practically, if we can accept that men and boys are struggling, what are we actually going to do about it at all levels within our communities? Politically, what can we do about it? And within our organizations. I love what I do. I do have some other wellbeing talks I deliver on burnout and community building that are separate to men's mental health. But men's mental health is the topic that I lead in my work with. And how I came into it, so I was formerly in an abusive and violent marriage, which I, of course, as most victims of domestic abuse, whether you're woman, man, person, you always think it's your fault that you've provoked all this trouble and that you're so useless and worthless. And if you were a better person, none of this would be kicking off. And coming out of that, I mean, I'm blissfully remarried today, but I went through a whole kind of rebuilding process, as one does, I suppose. And it gave me a real heart at that point for male victims of domestic abuse and the challenges that they face. We know that a third of victims of domestic abuse are in fact men, but that led to sort of wider men's well-being and that interest that I have. And in being in that field, seeing how divided that field is, you know, I make the point I was abused by a woman, but I was put back together by women. I'm happily married to a woman, remarried now. I have wonderful sisters, a wonderful mum. I have 2 daughters. And so for me, it's really spurred me on seeing how divided the field is. Actually, we need to do more in terms of gender unity. We need to do more. So I was at a networking event only a month or 2 ago where there were 2 ladies who should remain nameless from the diversity, equality and inclusion space, rubbing their hands together with glee that a big organisation down the road, the news is out that they're doing away with their pale male leadership. And this was a great opportunity for them. And for me, that's not how we're going to create unity moving forward. We see the issues in America. You have this sense of Republican men, the party of men, Democrats, party of women. We need to get rid of that. We need to be reaching out and creating unity for people. So that kind of drives me in my work. I'm saddened by the fact that Andrew Tate has any airtime at all is a very sad reflection on today's society.
Yeah, wow, there's a lot in there. There was some really key words for me about your journey so far. And this is why I reached out to you and asked you to become a guest on the Pivot podcast, because I felt that the work that you did was so closely aligned to the principles of Pivot and what I deliver through leadership with that framework. And I wanted to have a male's perspective because accidentally my kind of guests have been quite female dominant, because I guess my HR network is predominantly females, as the industry is. But what I was quickly realizing with my pivot leaders that I'm developing is there's this kind of hesitance around how to address or optimize men in the workplace and address performance issues with men, whether you're a male or female in that leadership role. And there's just so many reasons why it was starting to become a bit of a taboo topic or problem for managers to overcome, and to actually do some meaningful optimization in the workplace with people so people could feel well at work. So I want to thank you again for actually bringing this and sharing some of your story there, because I think it's super important how you've come into this, but then also what you've learned and what we can use today to help leaders work with that and take some things forward to go and help optimize men in the workplace. So why do you think it is so important to address men's mental health?
Well, we can address men's mental health whilst continuing to advocate for women and girls. I would say that a step forward for men is not a step backward for women. We can bring these issues together, and we need to. I mean, and I have this, my little stock phrase is that when you really think about it, and there's a lot of division within the sort of field of gender, and when I'm very active on social media, and there's a lot of division. But for me, every pound we invest for men and boys is actually a pound for the women and girls that love those men and boys. It's not a step. But likewise, of course, for women and girls is a pound for the men and boys that love those women and girls. But the data around men's well-being is troubling. And often it's the suicide data that is cited. Globally speaking, twice as many men die by suicide than women. In the UK, it's 3/4 of people that die by suicide are men, not women. There are those that would argue, yes, but just as many women attempt suicide, but they're not as successful in completing suicide. Men use more lethal means. So it doesn't mean that men are actually any worse off. And I often hear that as an argument. But actually, over 85% of people that are homeless in the UK, rough sleeping homeless, are men. 95% of people in prison in the UK are men. That's a stat that generally is the same globally for homeless and prison population. We know that economically, whilst you have a very small group of elite males, you look at the wealthiest people in the world, I think the wealthiest 20 people in the world, 19 of them are men. But that aside, there are large groups of men that are not faring well economically, and yet still the pressure, they'll be brought up to believe they need to be a provider, they need to be a protector. That is what they'll bring to a relationship. But we see these issues particularly for working class males. The data is there that suggests that economically their outlook is very poor. And I was reading some interesting research around childlessness, involuntary childlessness. So you don't wish to be childless, but you happen to be childless. But childless males, the percentage of childless males in the lowest socioeconomic bracket is 5-6 times higher than the levels of childlessness in the higher socioeconomic bracket. So the point is that for working class men are not faring well. And we're seeing that there are these gender issues. We're seeing across the world that men generally politically moving to the right of the spectrum, women to the left. So why should we tackle men's mental health? Well, I think everyone benefits, and large groups of men are struggling, and we need to do more. We can do more, and that's what drives me in my work.
Yeah, and I think, there's been some great work done for gender equality, and we see that a lot. And then what I think is happening now is that we have this sort of silent struggle for men, for those men who are in the workplace. And the gender equality is kind of quite loud, and we're making great strides for women at work. we're not where we need to be yet, but we definitely are. But the silent struggle around men's mental health, I'm definitely seeing, particularly around leader to team member conversations and how we manage the men in work. So that's what I, really wanted to kind of get your help with today for our leaders, was to think about how do we do this. So what kind of issues may men be dealing with in the workplace that perhaps they could be masking on a daily basis? If I'm leading a team, I've got a team of men that work for me and I'm responsible for optimizing them, what kind of issues might they be dealing with that they could be masking that I would need to be, raise my awareness about?
I do think this kind of men don't talk stereotype is a nonsense. Men will talk. Men do talk. There's been an explosion of men's communities across the UK, many of which are talking groups. 2/3 of men that die by suicide reach out for help in the months before their death. So men, let's work from the assumption that men do talk. At the same time, there are barriers in place that can make talking openly quite difficult. I will talk if I feel that I'm in an environment where others talk openly and are prepared to be vulnerable. If I don't feel that I'm in that environment, then there's absolutely no way that I'll be vulnerable. I suppose that's probably the same for women as well as men. But I do think for men, there is this pressure that maybe we put on ourselves, maybe society puts on ourselves, that we need to be a provider, a protector. We need to have it sorted. We need to have solutions. So if we ain't got solutions, if we're struggling, we really don't want to talk about it. But we might do if others are talking about their struggles. I see that in the pub on a Friday night after I play football with my men's football community. If one guy is struggling with his marriage and is prepared to open up about it, you get a few others that will. If one guy says I'm struggling financially, which guys find quite hard to talk about because we feel we need to be. But if one guy says I'm struggling, then another will say, oh, do you know what? Actually, I'm struggling as well. And so I think this notion of psychological safety and creating an environment where genuinely people can reach out, where genuinely people do talk about struggle, and leaders modeling that is really important. In my former marriage, I would go into work with cuts and bruises on my face. I was working for a recruitment firm. I worked with really nice people. I got on very well with them, great banter, great morale. I wouldn't have dreamt of saying what was going on, because they often say, hey, dude, what's up with your face? There's always a shaving accident, or I'd always say I was drunk in the shower or something or other. There's always a daft excuse. But the reason I didn't share with people that I knew and liked was because they weren't vulnerable either. It was the best bits on display team. So I do think as leaders, if you're leading men, whether you as a leader yourself or a woman, man, person, whoever you are, really being serious about psychological safety. Does my team even know what it is? We all need to know what the term is. There's one member of my team that can't correctly define psychological safety, then I've failed, and I need to make sure they know what it is. I need to give them permission to be psychologically safe, because no one wants to be the voice of doom. No one wants to be the naysayer. So as a leader, I need to be saying things like, even if you hear me on the phone shouting at one of our suppliers that's let us down yet again, if you've got something inconvenient to say to me or something, come to me, please do. I am here for you. So we need to reinforce that permission again and again and again, because it doesn't come naturally to us as people when we want to be on our best behavior at work so we can get ahead and be promoted so that we can provide. So giving people permission, managing your state when they do come to you with something inconvenient, so your face of thunder doesn't shut them down, modeling vulnerability, checking in regularly with people. These are all really important things that we can do. So I think it starts with psychological safety, but with those check-ins, I would just add, because sometimes people say to me, I don't know whether you hear this, but how would I even start the conversation?
I hear that all the time. And actually, I see it in practicals. It's the starting of it. But I love what you said there, because it was reinforcing permission. So that's a really interesting concept for managers to think about. We might say, you can always talk to me, and then we move on to the next task. And that's quite transactional. But reinforcing the permission, and I wonder just how many ways we can do that. And it is about that managing states, isn't it?
Yeah, and managing your state, for me, if we have managing state as a box, in that box is also, for me, it comes under managing your state, understanding that when you screw it up, which you will as a leader, because we're busy, we're under pressure. Give you an example. My son came to me. he came to say something to me. He knew I was busy. It was juggling him and the half term. I've got 3 boys, but he came into me and I looked up at him and I gave him that look and he walked straight out. He's soldiers.
Yeah.
And I went, but managing my...
I've done that myself.
But managing your state, therefore, for me, is me going back to him 10 minutes later and saying, I'm sorry. I know I've said to you in the past, come to me, and my face sent you away, and that was wrong. And I want you to come to me. Now, what he had to say to me was completely trivial, actually, because he then told me, and we laughed. And I said, well, look, probably if you'd have told me, I'd have said, come back to me later with that. But that face that I gave you was wrong. You know, if you see me do that again, remind me about psychological safety. He can define it. He's 11. He'll tell you what psychological safety. But that's part of managing your state. It's managing your state. And then when you get it wrong, it's then giving permission again and saying, look, I got it wrong. I'm human. Please. It's so important. How you can have those conversations, though, my wake up call if you're worried about someone in your team, then maybe you don't know how you're going to approach this.
Yeah, like that hard to reach person who you know is holding it together or something, or they're holding something. Yeah, how do we do that? Either
they're hard to reach or you might be worried about them, but you think you know what the issue is, but you don't know. So it's like, yeah, how am I going to, because he'll probably just say it's fine. So for me, I use the framework that my elderly female neighbour used for me, whether she did knowingly. It's just that I've since dissected it. So when I was in that violent, abusive marriage, I didn't know it was abusive. I just thought it was my fault. I just thought I was such a wally, such a hopeless fool. If I was a better man, this stuff wouldn't be happening. So I didn't see it as abuse. But my elderly female neighbour witnessed me being physically attacked. Now, she could have said, do you know what? It's none of my business. I won't get involved. They were probably just having a bad day. He's a strapping fella. He can take care of himself. But she didn't. And she sought me out. And she followed a 3-part model. I'll just very briefly share it. It's very simple. First thing she said, Andrew, she's very well spoken, so I'll do an impression of it if that's okay. She's like, Andrew, I'm very worried about you. So step 1, you reinforce your care for that person. She could have said, you matter to me. I value you. But a statement that just confirms that I care about you. She used the words, I'm very worried about you. She said, this is domestic abuse. So step 2 is direct dialogue. And I don't want to knock counselling and therapy. There's some counsellors that would be quite direct with you. I'd been in counselling previously, but my counsellor obviously worked on the basis of just asking questions. And I can see looking back, she asked all kinds of questions to try to get me to see what was going on, because I was in counselling to try and find the answer to be a better man for my wife, because I thought it was all my fault. But not once was there a breakthrough. It was just with all those questions, but direct dialogue in that one moment when she said, this is domestic abuse. I'd never heard that before. Now, if she didn't know it was domestic abuse, she could have said, do you think it might be domestic abuse? I wonder if it could be. That's still direct dialogue because you're naming the thing that you're worried about. So there's a statement, I care about you. There's direct dialogue. And then she finished with a, I'm here for you kind of a comment in saying, because I shrugged it off. She probably would have thought it had no impact at all. I shrugged it off because sometimes people aren't ready to hear it. Sometimes you've hit a raw nerve. Sometimes it will take them just time to process it. If it's abuse, most people are their abuser's greatest defender and excuse maker. So that statement, well, look, I'm here for you. Just anytime you need to talk, I'm here. So there's just a 3-part framework. A statement that says I care about you, direct dialogue, which can be compassionately given, and I'm here for you. That's it. That's a 3, just easy. That's what you do.
That's amazing. And I think, if, like you say, if then it doesn't open up the dialogue yet, that last bit, which is I'm here for you, really does then go back to your original point there about reinforcing permission, doesn't it? It just shows that you're there, and you've got to be persistent with that at a rate that person can cope with, showing that you're there you're ready when they're ready, kind of thing.
You can also model, I think, so if you ask me how I am I think it's more of a bloke thing, but I don't want to generalize on gender here. I want to be the last person to do that. But I do think you ask me how I am after a good weekend, I'll say I'm all right, yeah. Ask me after a bad weekend, I'm all right, yeah. Ask me after a mediocre weekend, I'm all right, yeah. So I think using form scores, saying, what are you out of 10 today? What do you reckon? Oh, I'm a 7. And then discussing why I'm a 7. So I do this with my boys just before bedtime, and it works really well. So if they say they're a 6, they always know what's coming next. Why are you not a 7? What might have happened that could have made you a 7? and 6 is okay. Why 6, not 4? And then that opens up a bit of conversation. So again, trying to set the environment where people are used to saying how they feel. As a leader, you could model form score. You could start trying to ask questions people out. Yeah, you said you're okay. I get that. But like out of 10, just like 10 being brill, 1 being awful, what would you give yourself? And then a why just starts to create that environment where people are a bit more forthcoming than they might otherwise be.
Yeah, no, that's also another great tactic. And that kind of leads into then we've got like a coaching model on the program that looks at, well, can this person deliver more grit in their role because they are optimized and they feel great because I know where their score is at? Or actually, no, is it about giving them a grace period and working with them around building their resilience and their emotional states before we can think about optimizing them in a work capacity? So that's really cool. And actually, I love that one for my own boys. So I'm going to totally pinch that and use that later with them, because getting dialogue out of them is like getting blood out of a stone. So that's really cool. Thank you. Okay, so if we're thinking then about myths around men's mental health, can you bust some of those for us? Because it can be very confusing, can't it? And I think for leaders, it'd be great if we could bust some myths around mental health and then think about how we can help people be the best version of themselves. So what are the myths that you kind of hear?
What a great question. I think, this is my own opinion, there'll be people that disagree with this. I often hear people speaking about men's mental health. They may not be speakers that specialize in it, or they might be, where really the key message is we just need to get men to talk. And there's a lot more going on in men's mental health than getting men to talk. So, for example, I talk about the testosterone crisis. We know that levels of testosterone across the male population, across the world, are declining rapidly. And often testosterone, we think of it as, well, therefore will men, that will affect men's reproductive ability. I suppose it might make men a bit more compliant. We'll all get on a bit better if there's less testosterone in the world. But actually, that's not true. Testosterone is hugely important for male physical and emotional well-being. The lower your levels of testosterone, the more likely it is you'll be depressed, anxious, you won't be able to concentrate. Your heart attack risk goes up quite significantly. The risk of getting prostate cancer goes up. So if you have prostate cancer, they'll reduce your testosterone as a means of treating it. But if you want to avoid getting it in the first place, there does seem to be quite a strong link with low levels of testosterone. And yet levels are falling off a cliff. The argument is not that whether they're falling or not. The argument is how drastic this is. And most research seems to suggest it is quite drastic. So if you have a man in your organization who's struggling with his mental health, it might be because he's got low testosterone. It might be because he's vitamin D deficient. It's not just because, we'll just get them to talk and everything will be fine. We know that for some men, although they do like to talk, they find it easier to talk, and they would talk if there were activities going on. Men in Sheds has been successful. My men's football group, successful. We have men's pie club in the Northeast. We have Outer Puff Daddy, the dad dancing group in Brighton. These are groups that are in Proper Blokes Club in London, are walking groups of men that walk every week. So these have shown that actually with some activities, actually men will talk. Men do talk. And if men are struggling, there's a whole host of possible reasons why they may be struggling. I do think some men have been very disillusioned, disengaged from well-being and DEI spaces because they don't feel they're welcome there. They see themselves as sort of pale males.
Yeah, like EDI isn't for men. Yeah. That's like a kind of a myth thing, isn't it? It's like not for men to be part of or look at.
And I think there's a weariness around what I would refer to, and you're talking to someone that, I know we're not sort of talking politics on this, but I am a liberal leftist voter myself. But I think there is a weariness among many men around patriarchy bashing. And I had one, there's a lady, a wonderful lady, and she runs a program called Lads Need Dads, and they mentor boys that don't have an active father. And when I say mentor, this is not a 6-week tick box exercise. They journey for lads for like 8 years. Wow. They're amazing. But she had a request. So an organization that will remain nameless, for Men's International Day, wanted to do it all about toxic masculinity and how men need to stop basically being toxic. And it was going to be a female speaker. And that's quite typical. And she's got involved and said, that's got to go. First of all, you could have a female speaker on Men's International Day, but is the focus really going to be on sort of tackling toxic masculinity, violence against women? This is like men's. So I think there is a weariness among some groups of men that means they're not engaged with the DEI space. So we need to think about our messaging and how we draw men into those spaces.
Well, we need to, that's what I felt like when we were going to do this podcast is, it's Men's Mental Health Day coming up. I wanted to really celebrate the men in the workplace, because we do a lot of leveling up in the workplace, but actually, can we just celebrate them too? They, I still feel like they need that empowerment and that optimizing, and to feel like they're being optimized and valued in the workplace still, despite all the challenges around gender.
Yeah. Because I think what many of the men will read, be exposed to, is either a demonizing of men in the press or sort of a belittling of men. I was reading an article in The Guardian earlier this year, having a bit of a pop at men who take additional paternity leave so their wives can go back to work. I'd have thought The Guardian would be in support of that. But basically it was sort of saying, yeah, but the men that take this additional leave, they're just sort of palming the kids off to grandparents and the like, and they're using it as a time to write their book, go to the gym. Poor old mum's coming home, so she's got double the amount of work. There was no balance in that article about men working really hard. There's no article championing men who are working remotely now so that their wives could maybe go out to work in a way that maybe they couldn't before. There was no balance. What about the couples where the woman is the much bigger earner and she's breaking her heart to go back to work early, but they have to as a couple financially? And it's not their choice, actually. Finances have dictated this. She'd rather be at home with the kids. There was no balance, but it was just an article to belittle men. So for me, I love that sense of sort of celebrating men in the workplace. Of course, there are men who behave very destructively. And for me, the terms toxic masculinity, the terms toxic femininity, they both belong in the bin. There are people who are destructive towards self and others. And the reasons for why they're being destructive will be complex, always will be complex. There'll be many factors that affect that. So I think trying to celebrate men more, I think, is important and is missing at the moment.
Great. Yeah, I do. I think it's a bit of a void too. So I agree. So that's on my agenda with Pivot Leadership, helping us celebrate the men in the workplace too. In thinking about then how we optimize people in the workplace and help them be the best version of themselves, focusing on men. So how do we get testosterone up? Is that the answer? Or are there other things that organizations can think about to do?
I think there are many things. So testosterone alone is not there's no singular answer. If there was, I'd have branded it, written a book and made my millions. There isn't a singular answer. I think testosterone awareness is important. The most obvious culprits for why testosterone levels are falling is lack of vitamin D. So awareness around really trying to encourage men to see the benefits of using health benefits. They've got that, giving men people time to go and get themselves checked up at the doctor. It's quite difficult if you're working full time to get a doctor's appointment, but getting your bloods checked, male leaders taking the initiative and sharing what they've done and encouraging their guys. And that's where the men's communities feed into this. So I'm seeing increasing numbers of organizations forming men's communities, using their male ambassadors to draw men into those communities. And then within those communities, they discuss stuff like, well, when's the last time you had your bloods done? Come on, you need to do this for your family, yourself. Go get your bloods done, because you won't necessarily know if you've got chronically low vitamin D. And the time when men might go to the doctor is if, of course, in terms of reproduction, erectile dysfunction might send them to the doctor. But actually, they could have low testosterone well before that symptom occurs. So I think men's communities is huge. Being aware that aside from vitamin D, ultra-processed food, sugar, sleep deprivation, substance abuse, lots of low-level stress all affect testosterone. We understand, I'd say the results aren't conclusive on this, but it's interesting for the way that we manage men is that it would appear from several smaller studies that when men believe they're winning, their testosterone levels go up. And when they believe they're losing, their testosterone levels go down. So actually that sense of the progress principle, celebrating small wins, be included into where guys are making an extra effort, celebrating that, helping them to see where they're making progress, those small gains, encouraging them to sort of develop goals that are achievable, that are inspiring, really important.
Oh, that's a comprehensive, holistic approach. I love that. I was just making some notes for myself. That's really cool. So how do we actively support men who are really, really struggling? Have you got some signposting, or in your experience, what you've seen organisations implement that work really well, or things that you're involved in?
Yeah, I mean, obviously, it really does depend on what's causing that struggle. I think trying to draw men into community, because usually why man's struggling, there are usually complex reasons. So I think having active men's communities, looking out for men who are, if you know that a man's struggling, trying to have that conversation with him, trying to signpost him towards his own trusted community, if there is one, is good. I think looking around in your area for what kind of things are there for men that they could plug into. Definitely a trip to the GP is useful. I would start there when I'm struggling, understanding that for some men, therapy and counselling, just they wouldn't even know where to start. And so actually, maybe a trip to the GP, maybe a trip to an Andy's Man Club, a Men in Sheds. They're the big national organisations that most people have heard of. The good news is it means that there's probably a men's shed or an Andy's Man Club somewhere near you. But aside from those, there are some amazing local organisations with all kinds of sort of varied purposes and activities. So I think community, GP, understanding that some men won't warm to counselling, maybe trying to find male counsellors as well and pull them in as a resource and being able to signpost them. For male victims of domestic abuse, Mankind Initiative is sort of one of the lead think tanks, and they have helplines there, very, very overrun with cases and work, but they do incredible work. There is a national domestic abuse helpline, of course, as well, the Samaritans. So some of it is the usual stuff, but I think it's helpful if you're an organisation that doesn't have a men's community, if in 3 years' time you have an active men's community, that's such a big step forward for men who are struggling, who might be struggling.
Oh, that's really cool. So I've taken from this conversation today that for us to be able to do this really well and look after and optimize the men at work, it's all about permission. So I've made like a permission list from the kind of techniques that you've talked through. So permission to talk if they want to and need to, permission to be there in the future if they want to keep that door open all the time, permission to look after themselves, attend GPs, attend appointments, attend any kind of therapeutic services that they need, or just permission to be part of the wellbeing agenda at work, whatever that might be. Again, permission around being included in EDI, because I think that they don't think they have permission in some of those forums, and I think we need to break that down. Permission to be part of coaching and managing their own mindset, but supporting that through leadership and one-to-one conversations. And then permission to join this active community. And obviously the active community has to be present. So that is permission in itself. So that's a pretty cool list. Thank you so much for your time and giving us this insight. Where can people learn more about you and what are you up to at the moment in this? I know this is a busy time for you. So what are you actually up to in your work?
Yeah, so I mean, Men's International Day, November the 19th. So many organisations are wanting to do, some organisations are booking me because they want to start a men's community and they want the talk to be a catalyst for that. A lot of organisations, they just want to do something for Men's International Day. So they book me because they know there's a number of things that I can talk about, do talk about. So I'm really busy with events through November. I will crash at the beginning of December, hopefully not too hard, and sleep for quite a long time because I've got events starting at all kinds of time because it's not all UK clients. So, I mean, it really is going to be an interesting 3 or 4 weeks. So really busy with events. and my podcast site, Men On Show, which celebrates everyday men. I've just recorded my 40th episode. I'm about to take some time off that and write
Congratulations.
that up. Thank you. Yeah, I need some time off from that. I'm going to write that up into a book, but I need to get a sense of where I'm going with that book so it's not an incoherent mess. It actually is a good resource. So that's kind of what's coming up. To get hold of me, my website's the best. I'm really easy to find because my surname is Payne. Initial is A. You'd have thought my parents would have thought about that, but it makes me easy to find. So it's andrewpayne.co.uk. And then if you wanted to connect with me on social media, I'm on all the platforms, but in truth, LinkedIn's the main one where I put most thought. So if you're on LinkedIn, do connect with me there. All the other platforms I post there, but I don't really do a huge amount with.
Yeah, no. And I will vouch for your LinkedIn, your videos and your tips and your thoughts are really, really insightful and really helpful. And that's where I found you. So it's a great platform to connect with you on there. And I know people will get a lot out of value out of that connection. So I am going to promote that and we'll pop that in the show notes for sure. Thank you so much for being part of this powerful conversation today, where we've explored this critical topic for men. I think it's really important that we think about creating workplaces where everyone feels safe and supported. And that's what I'm trying to create with this podcast. So your insights have reminded us about the importance of psychological safety. And then it's just not a checkbox, that it's actually a foundation for everything that we should be doing in our leadership. So for my listeners, what I'd really like you to do is think about what you've taken from this episode and consider ways that you can foster open conversations and break down the stereotypes with your own teams, remembering to support mental health openly and inclusively. So we're not just building stronger individuals, but we're also building stronger workplaces. Let's continue to build teams where everyone feels optimised by those around them. And until next time, keep optimising through your leadership with Pivot. Thank you. Thank you, Andrew.
Thanks very much.
Thank you for listening to the Pivot Leadership Podcast. For any information on anything we discussed in this episode, head down to the show notes. You'll also find my Pivot scorecard there, so you can take the test and see what your Pivot score is right now. Don't forget to like, rate and share the podcast, and subscribe now so you don't miss out on any future episodes.